Ted Dabrowski, thank you for joining us again on the Illinois Channel. And we wanted to touch base with you because you have always done some very good research on any number of aspects of government spending. And as we tape this, the legislature probably had the weirdest legislative session maybe in the history of Illinois because of the coronavirus, where normally they're in from the beginning of February through the end of May. And even then, many years, they don't get their work done by the end of May. This year, they did what they did in about 3 days, practically speaking, because those early days really didn't get anywhere. So now we have a budget pass for fiscal year 2021. And I will tell the viewers that a lot of times we have a budget book as reporters. We get briefed on the budget. We have numbers that we can look at in the budget documents. None of that happened this year. And for understandable reasons. I mean, I'm not saying it, but the bottom line is even people such as myself who normally might be up to speed on what the budget did and what we're spending, are largely clueless on that. And so you've done a good service by providing us some of the numbers, and that's what we will be talking about today. And for anyone who's suicidal, they may want to turn off now, because this is not going to be a bunch of happy talk. This is going to be a little bit, but it's going to be honest. So Ted, the fiscal 2021 budget that funds the state operations starts July 1. It runs through the end of June 2021. Give us your overview, and we also have some slides that we can bring up to help augment that. What is your take on the budget?
So the take on the budget, it's a very negative one, and sadly that's the case as we've had for many years of budgets in Illinois. And the reason why it's a tough critique of this budget is because this is a momentous time where you've got 1 million Illinoisans unemployed. Nobody knows what's happening with the economy. A large part of it is still shut down. We're slowly starting to open up. And yet the government passed a record spending budget. It's the biggest budget they've ever spent. There were no cuts, no furloughs, no kind of savings whatsoever to give relief to the Illinoisans that have to pay the taxes to pay for that government. There was effectively, and last, it has a huge hope for a bailout. It's got a $6 billion deficit. And they're hoping, the legislature, Governor Pritzker and others, are hoping that the federal government will lend them money to cover that gap, and then eventually to get a big grant from the government to pay off that debt. So it's no cuts, no furloughs, record spending, huge deficit, and hopes for a bailout. And just to add on top of that, a race for lawmakers. So it's not a good story for the average Illinoisan.
You and I have talked before about Illinois starts off, unlike some other states, already in a very shaky position, very fragile. The pensions, you and I talked about the pensions, and back then you said, with a lot of foresight, that any bump that comes along in the road, and this is before the coronavirus, that a lot of these pensions around the state in smaller communities for fire and police are probably going to go broke. Now, we're really focusing on the state budget, but I want to remind the viewers that this impacts you. It's not some distant, thing off in Springfield, that it's going to be impacting people across the state, and in certain communities, again, they could just automatically be going into pension systems that might be collapsing at the local level.
Yeah, this is very destructive. What's happening today is destructive for Illinois. And I did go back and watch. You and I spoke in October, November of last year, and we said there was going to be some exogenous outside event that was going to come along. We said we didn't know which one it was, and gosh, we had no idea. But it's here. It's called COVID-19, and it's made a disaster of the finances. They were already a disaster. We had no rainy day funds. We were already junk rated. Our pensions are the worst in the country. So we were not in a position at all to withstand the COVID-19. Since then, of course, we know Senator Don Harmon made his $42 billion bailout request. Senator McConnell from Kentucky came out and said, Senate leader, he said he's not going to bail out Illinois. Maybe bankruptcy is the right thing. So it's been a real big mess. And so with that as a backdrop, and a million Illinois unemployed, with that as a backdrop, it's fascinating, just fascinating that the Governor Pritzker and Mike Madigan and others have been able to pass a record spending budget with a massive deficit, no relief at all for taxpayers, no thought of even reducing spending, and then on top of that, just hoping for a bailout that might or might not come. But you can bet that the Illinois taxpayers are on the hook for paying all this stuff in the future.
Let's just start off with the big number, and any of the numbers were hard, as I said in the opening. Any of the numbers were hard to come by, and I think we're getting different information being reported. Last year's budget was roughly $40 billion. And this year's budget is sometimes reported as $40 billion. I've seen 42.6, which I thought was a number. Let me bring up a still that you provided us. And this shows that you're saying the budget is spending $42.9 billion. Now, how did you come up with that as the number that we're spending? And by the way, too, the revenues we see there, 36.8 in blue, I believe that's down, but I don't recall what the revenues were last year. I don't know if you recall offhand.
Yeah, so the process for trying to figure this out is to say crazy. You would expect a government to be very transparent about its budget, to release the numbers to everybody, make it public. Give reporters, give everybody who needs it, post it on the website. Here are the numbers we passed. Go look and you will not find it. What I had to do to try to do this reporting was to just call different lawmakers on both sides of the aisle and say, hey, somebody share something with me that was shared amongst the representatives. And I got different pieces. They're all different. They're from different days. Nothing adds up. Fortunately, the last bit, which is from the final bill, brought up these numbers and had the $36 billion for revenues. It had $2.9 billion for expenditures, and it had the deficit there. And unfortunately,
and that's a deficit of, we should say, $6.1 billion is what that is.
Correct. That's a massive deficit. The expenditures are 6% over the $40 billion that are expected to be spent in this fiscal year, which ends at the end of June. And so the process for that is so untransparent, so unprofessional. And every Illinoisan who has to pay these taxes, who's suffering, whose jobs have been cut, whose businesses have been shuttered, they deserve to know this stuff. And why it's a mystery, and why reporters are all reporting different numbers. Many are reporting 40 billion as the expenditure number. It's just not fair. And I think I guess it's part of the ridicule of Illinois, where we're not transparent and we're not professional about our finances. It's why we're almost junk rated, right?
The other thing I said is that slide we had up, which says we have revenues of 36.8. I will remind the viewers there too, this is a guess. Anytime you're putting together a budget projection, you're guessing. But you're going to have a pretty good idea. You're going to know what your revenues are going to be from taxes, more or less, and from businesses, more or less. They're not going to change dramatically, typically. But this year, all bets are off because of the number of people that have been laid off, the number of businesses that are shuttered. We really don't know what the budget numbers are going to be as far as what revenue is going to be coming in. And let me bring up the next slide here we have, and this goes to show that we have, as no surprise, this massive jump in unemployment. And as we speak here on the 28th of May, we had just today on the national level another 2 million Americans. I don't know how that breaks down in Illinois. But we're going to have unemployment going on for a while. We're just beginning, as everyone knows, the process of reopening. So those numbers are all suspect. And so let me ask you though, we can't blame the lawmakers for the budget numbers on the revenue side. We can on the spending. That's their business.
Well, if I just respectfully disagree with you, the whole question is about how we reopen, how quickly we reopen, and what we reopen. And Governor Pritzker has this executive order that he's extended, right? Many of us argue that it's not constitutional what he's doing, and the legislature had a chance to either legislate and allow him to stay open, allow him to continue his executive order, or to say no. And they punted on that. They didn't do it. And so what's happening now is, and this is a big point to your $36 billion estimate, the longer Governor Pritzker wants to keep the economy closed, Lori Lightfoot, same thing, the longer they want to keep it shut, the worse the revenues are going to get, the bigger the deficits are going to be, the bigger the unemployment is going to be. And of course, if the government does not cut its expenses, if it doesn't cut spending, if it doesn't cut payroll some, if it doesn't do some furloughs, well, who's going to pay for that? The ordinary people who don't have jobs. And so it's a real mess. And I think the legislature has done a very poor job of managing this right now.
And Ted, one of the things when we talk about those budget numbers, and again, that's revenue of 36.8 is the number you shared with us as far as what you had. There was some discussion in the legislature. They're counting you might say they're counting their chickens before they're hatched, but they're counting on about $5 billion from the feds in bailout money. We really don't know if the state of Illinois will get that or not. But is that $5 billion part of the 36.8, or would that be in addition to that?
That would be in addition to that. So that's how they plug the hole. And so this is another part of what's fascinating.
Although we would still have, if I bring that up, just to remind people of the number. So if we got $5 billion instead of a $6.1 billion deficit, we'd have basically roughly a $1 billion deficit.
Yeah, and then they're also hoping to change some of the other CARES money, which is some of the other money that they've gotten into revenues for other budgetary needs. So they're trying to figure out how to close it that way. But here's what's ironic about the whole thing, Terry. The more bailout money we get from the federal government, the longer Governor Pritzker and Lori Lightfoot can keep the economy shut. Right, the bigger the bailout, the bigger the support, the longer that they can, create this budgetary problem, because it'll get worse again. So we're kind of in a cycle, and for them to rely on the bailout is precisely the wrong thing for everybody, unless of course you're in the government sector,
what
which
are the arguments,
continues to get paid.
The argument they're going to make is obviously that it's not healthy to open it up. We're just going to go back to having all these cases, and now we have the number of people dying going down. What's the argument against that as far as the process that both the governor and Mayor Lightfoot of Chicago are having?
Well, yeah, they're getting a lot of pressure, obviously, as they see what's happening in the rest of the country, and as a lot of normal, ordinary Illinoisans want to get their lives back. And I think a lot of the data is now screaming at the politicians in a way that we didn't have this data 2 and 3 months ago, but now we do. We know that this is a new stat, but 48% of all deaths have happened in retirement homes, and retirement homes make up about when you add like assisted living and stuff like that, they make up about 1% of the total Illinois population. They have 48% of the deaths. So we're starting to recognize that the crisis is very concentrated in that group, and that group with comorbidities, with pre-existing conditions. This is not a general public threat in terms of deaths like we may have thought at the beginning. And so that means we have to adjust all of our thinking about school openings, about university openings, business openings. It's really time to get back to opening the economy and then protecting the heck out of those people that are at risk. And so that changes the dynamics, but Pritzker, Lightfoot, they continue to hang on to, I'd say, the more paternalistic approach to this, and it's showing up in huge dangers in the rest of the economy, with what happens when you have a depression or recession. You have more deaths from opioid deaths, you have suicides, things like that. So we really have to think about this reopening more properly.
The other aspect, though, that we have when we were talking about that massive unemployment that we had, and we bring that back up, we also have the argument that you were making is that the pain and suffering, so to speak, of the jobs lost is not being equally shared. And I think one of the criticisms you would make when we talk about the budget numbers and the spending is, where are the cuts? We have any number of businesses hanging on or trying to survive this, and obviously laying people off. And yet when we look at government is not really doing much to cut back on the number of people employed.
Yeah, this is I think in the end, hate to be so direct, but this is the hypocrisy of the whole thing, is that the government has determined what's essential and what's not. and they've determined that restaurants and bars and all kinds of small retailers, all kinds of small shops, they're not essential. The big box stores maybe are. They say they are, and we understand why, but they've shut down everything else. And then what's interesting about this graphic is you see the two most protected. The two most protected are the government and financial. And the government jobs that are there, 4% down, they're not coming from the state. Governor Pritzker has categorically said he's not cutting jobs. He's not furloughing workers. He's not cutting wages. And the same thing has been said by Lori Lightfoot. So that means these, some of these job losses I was looking up, East Peoria has announced job. Peoria, the same thing. A lot of these things are happening downstate because they don't have the means to keep paying for these things. So it's super hypocritical. This is again why we need to end this. We need to open up the economy. You can't have parts of sector picked on, parts of the economy picked on, jobs lost, jobs slashed, pay slashed, while the government continues to pay itself, protect all its jobs, and as we'll talk about, continue to protect their contracts.
You also note, as we get in this slide, that Illinois, as is shown here in red, has the fourth highest paid workers in the nation. The bars in blue represent the average pay from Illinois' surrounding states, including Missouri and Indiana and the others. We see that Iowa is at 58,000, Kentucky 52,000, Wisconsin is the 48,490, and Missouri government workers 45,768 hours on average. So obviously the people in Illinois are well paid, and in addition to their pay, and by the way, Ted, what is the average household income in America today? Do you know? Isn't it about $60,000? I think
it's about 56,000, something like that.
So if you had,
and that's household. These are individual
that's household,
workers.
Right? So you might have mom and dad working, and maybe one's making 20 and one's making 40, and you're going to have a $60,000 household income. So here, if you had two state workers making, I guess the average here, you would have twice the national average, just to put that in some context. Plus those other homes don't have pensions. And then lastly, on the still that you gave us, we have.
But just before that, Terry, it's important why that AFSCME state worker slide is there is because again, Governor Pritzker has asked all those other private sector jobs to stay at home, but all the public sector workers, regardless of what jobs they do, they're still being paid. And so they're still being paid. They are going to get big raises, in about $260 million worth of raises. Governor Pritzker has not stopped that. And again, these jobs are more essential than, quote, all the other jobs. And I think this is the implicit unfairness in all these contracts. AFSCME has a long-term contract. It's got guaranteed raises, guaranteed COLAs. Private sector doesn't have that. And this is, again, there's two classes of people in Illinois: the public sector class, protected by these long-term contracts and long-term pensions or guaranteed pensions, and then you've got the private sector who has no protections at all and can just be told to stay at home.
And then you also have here, we have the Chicago Teachers Union. Now the teachers went on strike. I guess that was last fall, as I recall.
That's correct. Mm-hmm.
Seems like 5 years ago now, doesn't it? With all that's happened in between.
Yeah, it was 6 months ago, exactly.
And so, tell us why, when we're talking about the state budget, why are we looking at a slide on the Chicago teachers contract?
Yeah, the teachers contract is amazing because I saw about 3 weeks ago that Lori Lightfoot has been finalizing the negotiations of this contract. There are some things that they've been quibbling about for some time, but she's been negotiating this contract all the while that she's been, cutting or deeming businesses closed, not allowing a reopening. People have been unemployed, et cetera, and at the same time, been negotiating these massive pay raises. And it just shows again the hypocrisy between what's happening in the public sector and the private sector. And it's important for us to know this because the state does pay a large part of what happens in Chicago. Chicago is looking for a lot of funding. Chicago is in huge trouble, and they're going to be reaching out to to the state for money, for the federal government for money. And so what happens in Chicago matters to all Illinoisans, especially as they look for a bailout, because Chicago now is broke. There's no doubt that it's broke coming out of this crisis.
So we've been carrying the governor every day when he has his press conferences, and he's talking in the early part certainly a lot about the virus and what the state's doing to respond to it. And I say this because it sounds like we're beating up on the governor and the lawmakers, but I think if I were to synthesize your arguments, you might say you're in the midst of an extraordinary period, but you're not taking extraordinary steps to deal with it. You're not cutting back as businesses are on people employed. We saw the high unemployment numbers in the private sector, and yet government is not doing that. Government is not cutting back on its spending overall. And so where's the equal pain and suffering when the private sector people are going to be losing their businesses? We have massive amount of people losing their jobs, and instead we have the government basically operating more or less as if they don't have to make cuts because the federal government's going to throw them a lifeline, and there really needn't be much pain for those who work on the taxpayers' dime. Is that it?
Yeah, I mean, you could say that. We could talk about shared sacrifice, or we could even ignore shared sacrifice, although you would expect there to be a shared sacrifice in a crisis like this. But I think that the bigger issue is that the government won't cut spending. They're actually, as we just saw, they're raising the budget by 6%. They are doing these raises, and who's going to pay for that? It's going to be the ordinary taxpayers, the same ones who've been mandated to shut down their businesses, the same ones that have been mandated to stay home. And so record spending on the government while people have less and less money. It's ludicrous and it's unfair. And that's all you can say about it. And so what has to happen, let me tell you, here's what has to happen going forward. It's going to happen if Illinois can't stay afloat. And this is a tough time for Illinois. We'll see if it can do it. Right now, it's already asking for bailouts, which means it can't. It has to cut these government contracts. It has to stop. We have to reform the pension plan. We have to change it. No more pensions going forward. We need to go to 401k style plans going forward. We need to end the COLAs for a long time because we can't. There is no inflation right now. We should freeze COLAs anyway. And then we have to stop these long-term government contracts that guarantee one class of workers certain rights that the rest of them don't have, and that the rest of them are forced to pay for. So those things have to change, Terry. It's just a matter of time. It's not sustainable.
We have the Illinois Supreme Court has already ruled that the 3% annual increase in pensions, which do you know offhand how much that adds every year to the state spending?
It's a few $100 million. When we're talking about pensions, of course, there's COLAs in all the contracts just for normal workers as well.
Cost of living increases, yeah.
Cost of living increases, yeah. So those are embedded in every contract, every public sector contract. So right now, that's going to cost, it's a lot of money.
Yeah,
and then when you add pensions to it,
what is the percent of the state's operating budget that goes to pension payments? Do you know?
Well, so that's interesting. It's been over a quarter to retirement costs, right? So when you take pensions, the debt for pensions, which are the pension obligation bonds, and you add retiree health insurance, where 75% of Illinois workers get free retiree health insurance premiums, you're talking over a quarter. But now that the revenues are smaller, it's because of the tax revenues are lower coming in. It's going to be over 30% of the money that we collect in taxes this year are going to go towards pensions and retirements. It's a crazy amount. There's no other state that comes anywhere near that. Nowhere.
So this is the thing that people, I think, who don't live and die breathing government information all the time, they extrapolate what they do with their household. They say we have revenues and we live within our means because we have to, more or less. Now, maybe they're using their credit card to live beyond their means. But, more or less the people are understanding that if they lost their job, they wouldn't keep spending the way they had been spending when they were employed. But what we're saying about here, the government, is when we're having the government lose a massive amount of income, basically the government losing its job, you might say, they're not making cuts. They're in Illinois constitutionally prohibited from cutting back on those pensions that they're now paying. In fact, those pensions automatically increase. And I don't want this to sound like a diatribe against government workers and government per se, but these are real numbers, and this is the real situation that all the taxpayers who are now unemployed in massive numbers are supposed to come up with their money that they're no longer earning to pay for this cost structure.
That's precisely right.
So what do we do? I mean, I would say, as someone who's followed politics, and you have too, the reality is Governor Pritzker is not going to be cutting back on state workers and laying people off. As we just said, he just has a big contract coming up, salary increases for state workers coming up in July. He's not going to pass a constitutional amendment or back a constitutional amendment to cut the 3% automatic increase. Instead, he wants a constitutional amendment that'll be on the ballot to tax those who make over $250,000 more. And of course, that would be a lot of people who are in business, which might, the governor says this won't happen, but a lot of those business people may say, why am I staying in Illinois when I can cross the border into Indiana or go to Florida or somewhere else and save a lot of money? Florida doesn't even have an income tax. So what are we going to do? Because the steps that you're saying need to be taken are not going to be taken.
Yeah, he's not going to take them. He's right now he's gambling with Illinois' future, and he's gambling on a bailout. He's gambling that some massive tax hike will bail out what's happening. But it's a gamble because, one, the federal government doesn't have to bail out Illinois, and so the worse, the more debt he takes on, the more risk he takes on, the bigger the fall is going to be, and that's going to hurt the average Illinoisan. And then the other gamble he's taking is that he can hike taxes. But that was a crazy idea even before the coronavirus. We've been losing people in record numbers. We lose more people than virtually every other state in the country, maybe except New York, and people are fleeing it. And so, raising taxes more after this environment that we're in is absolute suicide for the state. And that's what's sad for Illinois. And how this plays out, we don't know, but it's not looking pretty. And there's not a happy ending right now. The only happy ending will be that if it falls apart, hopefully we'll have some good ideas of how to pick it up and make it become a successful state again.
How much time does Illinois have, do you imagine, before the state's basically the state just goes bankrupt?
Well, we keep asking ourselves that question every year. We've been warning about this crisis, and these are slow. They take time. They're sad. They're like a cancer. It just continues to grow and grow and grow. So we don't know, but what we do know is that we did something a month ago that no state has done. And that's when Senator Don Harmon sent a letter to the congressional delegation asking for a $42 billion bailout from Congress. You don't go asking for bailouts unless you're running out of options. And that's the point is, Pritzker can't tax his way out of this problem. There's really no solution other than big reforms, and it's called a restructuring. You got to restructure Illinois, restructure its debt so that the government can be affordable again, so that services are better, and so that taxation makes more sense for people. Look, Terry, in the end, all of this comes down to opportunity. The bigger the tax hikes are, the bigger the property taxes are already the highest in the nation, the lower home values go. The worse pay gets, the more of your money is going towards taxes and government. People are going to look around and say, hey, I can go to other states and do better. And that's what happens. And at the other extreme is other people who are looking to move into Illinois would say, why would I move there so I have to pay all that debt down? I don't want to move to a state where I have to just pay debts from the last 30 years. I'm not moving there. So when you have that double whammy of people leaving and people not coming in, it's a spiral. And it's only that pressure at some point that's going to force the reforms on Illinois, but we're not there yet. But
You know, you can have your political agenda, but you either have money or you don't. And if you don't have the money to pay the bills and you have a constitutional guarantee of pensions, I don't know how the checks go out, because the comptroller office that writes the checks is, especially over the last number of years, we've seen where, yeah, we owe you the money, but the money's not in the account for us to cut you a check. And so we saw the state's unpaid bills go up to $16 billion when we had the Rauner years where he wasn't passing budgets. I mean, obviously that could happen. You could have a pension that's guaranteed, but maybe they're just sending you an IOU that says we're going to pay you when the money eventually shows up.
yeah, look, for me, there's no doubt that this state can recover. It's going to be after a lot of pain, but it's got great assets. It's got a great location. We're on the lake. We got these universities that are awesome. We've got, the agriculture. We have all the assets. We've just got horrible public policies and a legislature over time that has just destroyed what this state can be. But we don't give up on the state. What we do is we want to give up on the failed policies and put new ones in that allow us to grow and thrive. That's the key, is to have a great Illinois that's thriving, that's growing, that's attracting people, attracting businesses. And you can't do that when you're flirting with bankruptcy all the time. So things have to change, and we're pushing for those changes that need to happen.
But short of the governor changing the Illinois Constitution, are there other steps that you would recommend that he look to do? I mean, as just cutting regulations, is there other things that he could be doing to make the state more business friendly? And that's, of course, after we reopen.
Yeah, of course, and these are things that he won't do because he works very closely with the unions, but you've got to change the power of the unions in Illinois. They have the right to strike. They have the right to if they don't like a contract, they can demand forced arbitration. And so it's just that the union and the government, and you see that in the numbers that we showed earlier with the employment numbers, the government has all the power, and the ordinary Illinoisan and their communities don't have any power. And that thing needs to switch. That needs to change immediately. You can't continue to have the government or the unions have all the power. It's just too it's impossible for ordinary Illinois to get a leg up in this economy.
Dabrowski, we always appreciate you joining us on the Illinois Channel. I'm sure we'll talk again. And so thanks for joining us, and good luck to you in the future.
Thank you, Terry.
Thanks for watching. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our channel. And while you're at it, please leave us a comment. Thank you for watching.